costly because that's going to be the thing that we're focusing on. There's sequential arrival of traders, and making markets thicker is going to be costly in that it induces delay, and that is costly when agents discount the future. It's also, I think, at least an anecdotally established fact that measured by the number of traders that you have present in any given market at any given point in time, real-world markets are often surprisingly thin. Like if you look at continuous time double auctions, they execute any compatible trade instantaneously, and so very often you only have a couple of trades stored. And so from that perspective, these markets look very different from what you would think is the perfectly thick market of the textbook, of the competitive market that we use in textbook. So what we're doing in this paper now is, well, we've always done that, but the results are different, and the emphasis is different. So we consider a dynamic bilateral trade problem, a la Meyerson and Satterthwaite, where in every period one buyer-seller pair arrives. And there's a planner who decides whether to execute or store suboptimal trades, to be defined temporarily. And we show that for binary types, so buyers and sellers have binary types each, optimally thick markets are thin when measured by the maximum number of traders present. That's typically in single digits, and very often like 1 or 2 that you would store and not more. Yet, and that's the kind of a headline result, I think, is for any type distribution, like at least as long as you have compact finite supports, for any type distribution, storing just one suboptimal trade achieves 2/3 of the maximal achievable increase or gain from increasing market thickness that you can get from going from a bilateral trade problem to the market with a continuum of traders present. It's going to be defined on the next to next slide. But that's the measure that we're going to employ, and I'm going to show, and I'm going to try to convince you that 2/3 of that increase is achieved by just storing one trader. And so from that perspective, while observational these markets may look very thin, their behavior is going to be very close, or reasonably close, to the behavior of perfectly thick markets, or the textbook model of a competitive market. A lot of the analysis that we're going to do is not going to be involving incentives, so we're just going to think about ex post efficient or efficient trade in appropriately defined. So we're going to know, the planner is going to know the types of the agents who have arrived. But importantly, we're going to show that once you account for incentives and second best mechanisms, the gain from storing one trade or from whatever number of trades you want to store, is going to be even larger once you account for second best mechanisms. Okay, let me try to be a little bit more precise, and a little bit more concrete, and I'm going to also introduce some.
Can I just interrupt? Are you partway through the slide deck? Because at least on my screen, I'm still looking at the title slide.
Oh, that's the thing that happened, I think, from, okay, sorry. Is that true for the other ones as well? That happened while I was teaching.
Yeah,
so
only switch now.
Okay, now I can see it.
I think it's the issue that I went to full screen. So you see that now? Okay, so this is what I was talking about. I remember very well that so that you see that now. Okay, should I rewind? So I said this. Okay. Now you see it, okay? Yeah, okay, sorry. So let me be a little bit more precise about the things that I just said, and also I'm going to introduce some of the notation that we're going to use below. So here on the left-hand panel, you just have the bilateral trade problem, right? There's the seller's cost on the horizontal axis, the buyer's value on the vertical axis, and on ex post efficiency, you should have trade whenever the buyer's value is above the seller's cost, so when you're above the 45-degree line. We find it useful to dissect this region of ex post efficient trade into this square and these two triangles. So the square is above, the buyer's value is above P and the seller's cost is below P. And P is the limit valuation price. So if you think about the competitive equilibrium with a continuum of trade is present, P would be the market clearing price. And so the types that are in here, they are agents that would, or these are types of agents who would also trade in the perfectly competitive market. And then these here is this delta H and delta L. These are the values of suboptimal trades. So this is a buyer who would trade in a valuation market with a seller who wouldn't trade. And this here is the value of a trade between a seller who would trade in the competitive limit and a buyer who would not trade there. But in the bilateral situation, these trades create surplus, and so you would execute them if you confine to the static bilateral trade problem. And so when we talk about the benefits of sorting, is that from the large market, is that you avoid these deltas, right? You get rid of these mismatches. Here you're wasting a seller, and here you're wasting an efficient buyer. And so we're going to call buyers efficient if they have values above P, and sellers efficient if they have values below P. And so that gives us, and the other ones are going to be called inefficient. So the definition of efficiency and inefficiency is going to be with respect to the valuation limit price. Okay, and so what we denote by, yeah, I think you can see that. Well, I can. So what we denote by V upper bar is just the expected value of the buyer's type, given that it's above P, and C lower bar is the seller's cost, given that it's below, conditional being below C. And so then in the continuum limit, the per trader pair welfare or social surplus is denoted by S infinity, and that's just given by the valuation quantity or the probability that you trade in the valuation limit, which is W, right? The probability that you're above or below P times that expected surplus. And so S naught is, in contrast, is the surplus that you get in the bilateral, the expected surplus that is created in the bilateral trade setting with just one buyer and one seller. And an important thing is going to be the difference between, this is annoying thing. An important ingredient that we're going to use is the difference between S infinity and S naught. This is our measure. This is the base. This is how much you can maximally increase the benefits of, or the maximal increase in benefits from market thickness. Right? It's going from the static bilateral trade problem to the continuum or perfectly competitive market limit with a continuum of traders. And so S infinity minus S naught is how much you can possibly gain from increasing market thickness. And so then our measure of market thickness that we propose and that we think is natural is denoted by T of tau, T standing for thickness. And it's given by the difference of S tau minus S naught divided by that number, by that difference that I just mentioned. And S tau here is the expected, to be defined properly, right, formally below, but S tau is the expected per period payoff under the stationary distribution that you achieve by a policy that's denoted by tau, right? And so this is our measure of market thickness. And so what we're going to show is that if you store tau up to tau suboptimal trades, maybe I should be a little bit more precise here. What is a suboptimal trade? Well, it's a buyer with a value above V and the seller with a cost above, sorry, a buyer with a value above P and the seller with a cost above P. Or conversely, a buyer with a value below P and a seller with a cost below P. That's a suboptimal trade because it consists of an agent who should trade under efficiency in the continuum limit and an agent who wouldn't and shouldn't. And so tau is going to be the maximum number of such identical suboptimal trades that you're going to be willing to store. And if you store tau of them, we're going to show that that T of tau is going to be this number here, which, you know, you can do the math, right? If you set in tau equal 1, you get that this is 2/3. And this is increasing fast in in T, in tau, sorry. And then, as mentioned before, if you denote the appropriate numbers by SB to account for second best, we're going to show that accounting for second best, this increase is going to be even larger. In a nutshell, the main reason for that is that second best alleviates the incentive problem. Storing traders alleviates the incentive problem that you face for a second best mechanism in a very intuitive way that will hopefully become clear. Moreover, we have an implementation result. So in the binary type setting, you can implement the efficient policy with a posted price mechanism that always balances the budget as soon as it's optimal to store one suboptimal trade. So you get rid of any sort of second best problems as soon as storing one trade becomes optimal. And for continuous type distributions, we provide a budget balance mechanism that is an almost posted price mechanism. I'll be more precise about what that almost means when we get there. That almost posted price mechanism implements threshold policy provided tau is larger than 1. And as I said before, if you measure the number of traders present at any given, the maximum number of traders present in at any point in time, this number is going to be small in our setting. So tau star is the maximum number of agents that you would be willing to store, and little delta here, that's the discount factor. And so you see for large values, the number of agents that you would be willing to store is 0, and then it becomes 1, and then it increases. But even here, when the discount factor is very close to 1, you're still only storing, say, 6 traders maximally. And to give you an impression of what these values of delta, this big delta, mean, so they're in the order of what you would have if you have continuously distributed types and uniform distributions. So that's sort of the ballpark number. So here's a high-level literature review. I can also fast forward to the detailed literature review, but I think the paper contributes to or relates to the double auctions literature that has emphasized a lot the incentive effects of increasing markets or market thickness. In contrast to that literature, we're able to derive an optimal degree of market thickness, and our incentives or our motivation, the driving force behind increasing market thickness in our model is going to be the sorting aspect that has received little attention, as far as I know, in the literature today. There's also a connection to the literature on valorization microfoundations for competitive equilibrium, microfoundations for valorization equilibrium. There and here, price distributions are going to converge to the valorization price as the discount factor becomes large. But in our setting, the equilibrium under price posting is almost always efficient. There's a connection to coarse matching, in particular McAfee's 2002 econometric paper that also has a unit free measure of minimal gains that you get from simple mechanisms. Obviously related to bilateral trade and the Coase theorem and the recent upsurge of interest in the dynamic matching literature. Okay, this is the setup. Recapping basically what we had with a little bit more precision. So here I'm introducing the symmetric binary typesetting. So the Bayer's type can be V lower bar or V upper bar. The seller's cost can be C lower bar or C upper bar. We assume this ordering here. So high value buyer can trade with any seller to mutual benefit, and the low cost seller can trade with any buyer type. But the high cost seller and the low value buyer cannot trade with each other. So that basically cannot, to mutual benefit, cannot trade with each other. So that basically means that the valorization price is in the interior, right? So or put differently, the variation quantity is not equal to 1. And so we're going to assume that the probability of being an efficient trade, of being a C lower bar or V upper bar, is going to be some number W. We're further going to impose symmetry in that we assume that this difference here is the same as this difference here, and that's denoted by delta. This is really done for simplicity. If these deltas were different, you would still, everything that we do is still going to be true, except that you're going to have two different threshold values depending on what kind of suboptimal pair you're storing. And there's two almost equivalent interpretations. So one is you can take this here literally as the binary typesetting as which I just presented it, or you can think of it as a discrete version of the continuous type setting that I showed before on slide 4. So the only difference to bear in mind is that the optimality results that we're going to talk about, that we're going to present, they pertain to the binary type setting. All the other results hold otherwise, but to the extent that we talk about the optimal market thickness, that's shown for the binary types setting. Okay, so that's the type setting in every period. We're looking at an infinite horizon model. In each period, a buyer-seller pair arrives. Standard buyers have single unit demands, sellers have single unit capacities. There's a common discount factor, delta, little delta. Types are independent and persistent private information. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Agents are risk neutral, have quasi-linear utility. The distributions are all of the above are common knowledge. And so here's how we're going to proceed, or sort of the outline of much of the remainder of the talk is we're first going to formulate and solve the Markov decision problem of a planner who, now here comes the relaxation of the assumption of privately known types, who is going to be assumed to know the types of the agents who have arrived. He's not going to know the types of agents who haven't arrived. He just knows from which distributions they're drawn. But the planner is going to know the types of the agents who are here. And then the planner maximizes is expected discounted social surplus. And that's the first step. And we're going to show results for that setting. And then in a second step, and for the purpose of the talk in a sort of a high level kind of way, we're going to augment the optimal policy that's derived in step 1 by a queuing protocol or tie-breaking rule that gives you an allocation rule. And then we're going to argue or convince you that you can implement that in an incentive compatible and individual irrational way. Specifically, we're going to focus on price posting mechanisms a lot, partly because they're very simple and have real world appeal and allow us to derive things about price distribution, etc. There is, I'll return to that for a minute or two, but there is an isomorphism between profit maximization and social surplus maximization, in the sense that once you replace in the objective function, replace the true types by the virtual types, the problem is isomorphic. And so whatever we're going to do here in step 1 is actually also going to solve the profit maximization problem, qualitatively at least. Okay, this being economics, you might not be surprised to see that there's going to be a trade-off. So the trade-off in our setting is the following. So whenever you have an inefficient high pair or an inefficient suboptimal, I should say, suboptimal high pair or suboptimal low pair present, you as a planner, you face a trade-off. Should you clear now, you get a gain in social surplus of capital delta. Or should you speculate and wait for the arrival of, actually, what are you waiting for? You would be waiting for the arrival of an opposite suboptimal pair, right? So if you have a high pair stored, you would be speculating that sometime in the future, hopefully soon, a suboptimal opposite pair arrives, which then allows you to execute the trade between the V upper bar guy here and the C lower bar guy. right? And that's the only reason why you would want to wait, is that it's going to arrive an opposite suboptimal pair, and then you can execute an efficient trade. Because if an efficient pair arrives, well, there's no point waiting, right? Because that pair arrives anyway. So you can execute that efficient trade immediately without storing. And if an identical suboptimal pair arrives, you have gained nothing. And if an inefficient pair arrives that is a V lower bar, C upper bar pair, you can just trash them, because that's the worst that can happen to you. It's a worst case scenario anyway, so you have no gain there. Okay, so we define, it's not going to be too surprising that threshold policies are optimal in this setting, but what is a threshold policy? So threshold policy pi sub tau immediately clears efficient pairs. So if a V upper bar and a C lower bar type arrive, you just clear one of those, or you just clear that trade. That's one way to think about that. And it stores identical suboptimal pairs up to some threshold tau, right? And so if the deltas were different, that's what I was trying to say before. If the deltas were different, the thresholds would be different depending on which pair you're talking about. And so what is true is that any threshold policy induces a Markov chain denoted by YT over the number of stored suboptimal trades, little y that can go from 0 to tau if your threshold is tau. And so if we denote by lambda the mismatch probability, which is w times 1 minus w, then we can depict the Markov chain in this beautifully crafted graph here. So this is the empty, if you want to think about it as an order book, this is the empty order book. With probability 1 minus 2 lambda, an inefficient pair arrives and you stay in that state. And in all other situations, sorry, that wasn't quite right. It's both situations, and an efficient pair arrives, you clear it and you stay in that state, or an inefficient pair arrives and you stay also in that state. So these are the two situations in which you stay in state 0, and otherwise you move up. And so on until you reach, in these situations here, you only clear from state 1 to tau minus 1. The only trade that is cleared is an efficient trade. And then you come to this state here in which this boundary state, you clear an arriving efficient trade, and you clear an efficient trade that you can create, and you clear a suboptimal trade of the kind that you have stored. So that's what's defining the boundary state tau. Okay. And now this is a lemma that was present in the paper for a long time, but it was more stated as a technical result, but it turns out to be key for our results. So it describes the stationary distribution of the Markov chain under the threshold policy pi tau. For all y between 1 and tau, the probability of being in that state is 2 over 2 tau plus 1, and the probability of being in state 0 is a half of that. So there's a uniform probability over all. They go back here. There's a uniform probability over all these states here, and then this state here has the empty order book state has half of that probability. Okay, and that's sort of what I'm highlighting here. Now, why is this useful, or why is it key? So remember, in order to get our measure of market thickness, that T of tau thing, we need to compute S sub tau, the per period expected social surplus, or equivalently per traded pair expected social surplus. And so in order to compute that, we need to use the stationary distribution kappa. Okay, so let's first look at the expected payoffs in the different states y from 0 to tau. So in state 0, what do you do there? As I said, you execute an efficient trade if it arrives, which happens with probability W squared, and otherwise you don't get any payoffs in that state. Therefore, S of 0, little s of 0, is W squared times V upper bar minus C lower bar, which, going back to the notation we introduced that in the introduction on page 4, is W times the welfare that you get in the continuum limit S infinity. And then in any state Y, and I suppose once you think about it that way, it's not so surprising that the market thickness increases so fast. In any state Y, that is where Y is positive, as soon as you are here, in any of these states, you get at least S infinity. Why is this? Well, you only execute an efficient trade there, but what's the probability of having an efficient trade? Well, you have an efficient trade stored. Well, with probability W squared, an efficient pair arrives anyway, so you get that for free. But with probability W times 1 minus W, an opposite inefficient pair, suboptimal pair arrives, in which case you can create an efficient trade. So the probability that you get an efficient trade in any state where you have a trade stored is W squared plus this here, which is equal to W. So with probability W, you execute an efficient trade in all these states, which is exactly what you get in the continuum limit per traded pair. And then in the state, in the boundary state, you do not only execute, you get this payoff here as well, but on top of that, you execute a suboptimal trade if an identical suboptimal trade arrives, right? Which gives you this payoff here. Okay, and so then if you do the algebra right, it took us a couple of weeks to come up with that simple formula, but once you see through the thickets, it's quite simple. So S of tau is just 1 minus kappa 0 S infinity plus kappa 0 times S naught. And so then if you take the difference S tau minus S naught, you get 1 minus kappa S naught times S infinity minus S naught. And so you plug that into our formula for market thickness, and then you see that T of tau is actually equal to 1 minus kappa 0. And then you plug in kappa of 0, which is, what was it, 1 over 2 tau plus 1. And so if you evaluate that at tau equal to 1, you get 2/3. So the unit-free nature of that result is entirely driven by the structure of the distribution of the stationary distribution of the Markov chain. I think it's similar in spirit, although quite different in nature, to from McAfee's result that with positive assortative matching and the continuum of buyers and sellers, to get an efficient allocation, you would have to have infinitely many classes where you match the top, the highest value buyer, the highest value or highest type woman to the highest type man, etc. So you need a continuum of classes to get the social surplus maximizing matching or assignment. And if you divide the two sides at their median, appropriately chosen, if you just create two classes and then have random matching within the two classes, you get at least 50% of the maximum increase that you can get. And so this result here is large, it's 2/3, but the spirit of the bound, I think, is similar. Okay, so why should we care about beyond that? Why should we care about threshold policies? Well, in the binary type setting, the optimal policy is threshold policy, and we denote the optimal threshold by tau star. And so this here is sort of in some ways, the summary of one of the headline results is that reconciling the fact that observationally markets are often very thin, but yet in their behavior, or in some sense, even very thin markets behave as if they were very thick, in the following sense, right? This here is the maximum, or this is the optimal threshold storage, tau star, or optimal storage threshold. And you see that, as mentioned in the introduction, that number is very often in single digits. And we do some comparative statics formally in the paper, but it's very intuitive that you're more willing to store when big delta is smaller. So that's indicated here by the purple versus the blue. But these numbers here are just very small typically. But yet then if you look at the increase at T star, which is T of tau star, the gain from or how much of the maximum gain of increasing market thickness you achieve, you're very close to 100%, even for these small storage numbers. Yeah, so we also have, I should have said this as it's now a proposition in the paper. There's a bound. So if you have, if big delta is 0.4 and the discount factor is 0.95, then you still do not store more than 9 agents or suboptimal traits. So that's sort of the, at the same time, market thickness really matters, right? But you achieve a lot of thickness. I suppose that's one of the big new insights that we have from this revision, is that not only is tau star quite small, but T star is actually quite large very quickly. Okay, so of course, right, assuming that you know the types of the agents who arrived is not what you would usually do, but it was a useful exercise, as I will try to convince you now. So
hey Simon.
Yep.
Simon, sorry, Jiantao here. Just to clarify, this result of 2/3 is quite interesting. Just to understand a bit further about under what settings do this result hold? You mentioned this for binary types, but this also holds for continuous type distributions?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I can say that with the benefit of hindsight, right? We were, it's a very recent discovery, right? But, the distributions do not matter at all, right? If you go back to this setting here, if I, whether or not you have binary distributions, if I put agents into two classes, right, above and below the valuation price, you're efficient or inefficient as a function of that, then this is now binary, right?
Okay.
And so
okay, yeah.
all the results that we have for binary distributions, other than the optimality of the threshold policy of the threshold, pertain to continuous distributions. And any distributions for that matter, right? Because you can always look at the separate agents into above or below the valuation limit price.
Yeah, yeah. Have you also thought about how this result relies on the assumption that in each period there's one pair arriving? Like, does this change linearly? Like, if let's say there are two sets of buyers and sellers arriving in each period, would a similar result generalize to that setting?
Well, short answer is we haven't thought about it.
Okay, yeah, never mind. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Interesting question, yeah. Any other questions? I'm very happy to take any, or, well, ex ante. Happy to take any. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about incentives, but I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of the dynamic mechanism design aspects, but I'm going to try to convince you that, and I'm going to demonstrate actually that you can account for incentives quite straightforwardly. So as mentioned, thus far, the optimal threshold policy assumed that the types of the agents were known. And so now we're going to relax that as you would in mechanism design. So we're going to assume that the agents are privately informed about their values and costs. Also, one thing that may not have been that explicit thus far is that the optimal policy is anonymous insofar as it does not, you have multiple efficient buyers stored. It does not specify which one you're going to clear. But what I want to try to highlight here is that you very often have in mechanism design anonymous mechanisms, right, that should not treat agents according to their names, etc. Right? But a mechanism still has to specify who is going to trade, and the policy per se does not do that. It just says, well, we clear one of those efficient guys. Okay, so long story short, we need to, in order to deduce or create an allocation rule that implements the efficient policy pi tau, we need to augment it by a queuing protocol or a tie-breaking rule that specifies which of the stored traders are going to trade if there are multiple stored traders. And so essentially, once you augment the policy pi tau by a queuing protocol, you obtain an allocation rule queue. And it's not, I suppose, flabbergastingly surprising that Q has the right monotonicity properties. It has to, when you're a higher value buy, when you're a buyer with a higher value, you must be more likely to trade, etc. Q has these monotonicity properties, and that permits incentive compatibility. And we can also show that the expected revenue of the mechanism is expected discounted revenue of the mechanism is invariant to the queuing protocol. So that's a lemma in the paper. And so I'm not going to talk much about, or actually for the rest of the talk, I'm not going to focus on profit maximization, but just foreshadowing or being a little bit more explicit how you can do profit maximization. If you replace the true types by virtual types, then in that sense, then you see that the expected discounted profit maximization is isomorphic to maximizing expected discounted social surplus. And what you need to do is you need to adjust delta for not the difference between V upper bar and C upper bar, but it needs to be the difference between V upper bar, which is also the virtual type of the high value buyer, and the virtual type of C upper bar. And likewise, you take the difference between the virtual type of V lower bar and C lower bar. And that gives you a smaller delta, but you can do just comparative statistics with respect to delta. And then you have the profit maximizing policy. And with an appropriately chosen queuing protocol, you get the profit maximizing allocation rule. Okay, so that's a short story about profit maximization, but I think it does the trick. So for the remainder of the talk, I'll focus on posted price mechanisms, or at some point on almost posted price mechanisms. You will see what that means. And that is going to refer to the situation where you have continuously distributed types. Okay, so let's look at posted price mechanisms. And we also look in the paper, we also look at profit maximization through posted prices, etc., or the profit maximizing implementation of the efficient policy through posted prices. But here our focus is going to be on uniform posted prices, in the sense that in every period there's a single posted price, and if there's trade, the buyer pays that price and the seller receives that price. Recall that in the states y from 0 to tau minus 1, you only execute efficient trades, right? So if the order book is empty, you only execute an efficient trade, otherwise you store or reject them. the arriving traders. And in any of the other states, you only execute an efficient trade. And so that means that in all of these states, y less than tau, you can just post the valuation price, right? And if the order book is empty and an efficient buyer and seller arrive, they're given the choice to trade. They can say yes or no. If they say if they both say yes, they trade. If one of them says no, he's going to be rejected, and you store the other one, right? Or if you have somebody stored and one of them rejects and the other one says yes, you execute the efficient trade that you can create. Right. So in all the states that have an index less than tau, you can just post the price p, and you execute the efficient trade that you want to execute according to the threshold policy. Here's something. Here now with posted prices, the queuing protocol is going to matter. So we're going to focus on the last in, first serve queuing protocol. So as to get it off, so as to avoid incentives to get stored in order to potentially trade at a better price in the future. In the unrestricted mechanism design problem, where by unrestricted I mean we do not restrict the form of transfers that you can make, we just assume you need to satisfy incentive compatibility and individual rationality. There, the queuing protocol doesn't matter. But once you focus on a restricted mechanism, like posted prices, then the queuing protocol does matter. Okay, so here's a last in, first serve queuing protocol. Yeah, as said, in these states, if an efficient trader arrives that cannot trade, you just store him up to the point where you reach the threshold tau. So now suppose we're in the state, the last thing I need to do or show is that what you do in state tau, right, once you reach that boundary state. So suppose you have the stored agents are sellers, which in line with the notation we had before, we're going to call the low state, that's the delta L state, or then you set a low price PL to make sure that even the low type buyer wants to buy. And if the stored agents are sellers, if the stored agents are buyers, then you're going to set a high price to make sure that the arriving seller wants to trade, even if he's of a high type. And so with binary types, you can implement the efficient policy with a posted price mechanism as soon as it's optimal to store at least one trade. And so that's our proposition 5. With binary types, efficient policy can be implemented with a budget balanced, indeed, posted price mechanism, provided it's optimal to store at least one trade. And so one way to think of this is that it's a dynamic reconciliation of sorts of the Coase theorem that says, well, agents should be able to trade efficiently absent transaction costs, with the impossibility theorems of Vickrey, Hurwitz, Meyerson, Satiswade, etc., that indicate the private information is, or that show that private information in static settings can be an insurmountable transaction cost. And so here, once you account for dynamics, you can get efficiency without the deficit. Okay, now going back to incentives. So with binary types, you do not have the general impossibility theorem of Meyerson Satiswade. So that depends on the parameterization. So of course, if you don't have impossibility with binary types in a static setting, then this here is going to hold with equality. Accounting for second best is not going to change anything. But if you do have impossibility in the static, depending on parameterization, that's the case. If you do have impossibility in the static binary type bilateral trade setting, then as soon as it's optimal to store one trade, you're better off with the second best mechanism for the reason that as soon as you store a trade, by proposition 5, you're going to be able to implement the efficient allocation without running a deficit. So that's one reason. So you have a larger increase between, say, S tau and S naught SB. So that's larger. And the other aspect that comes into play is that because with second best in the static setting, the S naught is smaller, so you are more, or you're more inclined to store a trade. So this is two effects that go in the same direction, which make the increases from market thickness even larger once you account for incentives. And so this here is a picture that, one of the reasons, other than, kind of practical appeal, etc., of the posted price mechanism and the simplicity is it also allows us to derive equilibrium price distributions, and in the paper we also have equilibrium price dynamics from simulations. And so in contrast to most of the reviewers, we actually quite like these comparative statics. So maybe this is subject to change, and the reviewers are also going to like it. Here the blue line is just a uniform distribution over the different posted prices. With equal probability, you have a price of 0.5 and the low price and the high price. As the storage threshold increases, the distribution becomes more centered around the moderation price of 1/2. And so it's sort of a very coarse, but you can sort of see the distribution becoming more normal with a mean equal to the limit valuation price. And so in some sense, you have similar convergence properties to the large market valuation price as you would have in search models, where you let the search friction captured as by the discount factor delta, let that go to 0. That is, let the discount factor go towards 1. So like Archneyrov's and Mark Satterthwaite's papers are in that spirit, or Stefan Lauermann's. An important subtle difference between these microfoundations papers and ours is that, well, in our setting, the posted price mechanism implements the efficient policy for any value of delta as soon as it's optimal to store one trade, right? So in their model, things are always, or in their approach, things are always inefficient away from the limit, away from delta towards 1. Whereas here, everything is going to be efficient, but the convergence still occurs as delta goes towards 1. Okay, now, and I think that's part of the skepticism that these results, or kind of lack of love that they encountered hitherto, was like, well, you do this for binary types, but this is sort of an example and not more. Maybe it's too cute even as an example. So similarly with the possibility result that we had in proposition 5. So that hinges critically on binary types, and so we don't know quite. So that's sort of a common reaction. We don't know quite what to make of that. So the question is, does it really depend critically on these types being binary? And now I'm going to try to convince you that this is not the case. So for that purpose, not that I'm particularly going to use that notation here very heavily, but still, assume that buyers draw their types independently from a continuous distribution F. Sellers independently draw their types from a continuous distribution G, who supports without loss of generality, we're going to confine to B 0, 1. This is without loss of generality because all you need is that the valuation price is somewhere in the middle of the supports. If the valuation quantity traded is 0 or 1, then there's no interesting problem to solve. And so the valuation price being in the middle somewhere corresponds to the overlapping supports assumption of Meyerson and Satterthwaite. And once you have that, for our intents and purposes, we don't need further generality. So we just need the valuation price to be in the overlap of the two supports. Okay, so as I think we discussed before, right, I can always translate the continuous type setting and the large market, according to the large market limit, into a binary or a two-class mechanism where agents are being treated as efficient and inefficient relative to their value, relative to or as a function of how their value or cost relates to the valuation price. If you're above the valuation price as a buyer, you're efficient and inefficient otherwise, and likewise for sellers. And so for any state, I have a storage threshold tau. For any state y that's less than tau, I'm just going to proceed in exactly the same way as I did in the binary type setting. Right? I just post the valuation price p and execute any available efficient rates and store efficient rates that arrive as part of a suboptimal pair of the type that I've already stored, and reject all inefficient pairs. So the only difference or the only complications arise in the state tau. Right? Before, in the binary setting, I can just set a price equal to either V lower bar or C upper bar and then execute that suboptimal trade. And now with the kind of Myerson-Satisway problem at hand with continuous types, that is not that straightforward. Okay, so let me talk you through this, hopefully in enough clarity to demonstrate how things work. So consider state tau and assume things being symmetric. Let's focus on the case where the stored agents are sellers. Right, so you have tau sellers stored. So now in that period, an additional pair arrives. Temporarily, you're going to forget about the buyer. You're first talking to the seller, and you ask the seller, do you want to trade? And then, do you want to participate? And if the seller says no, well, you reject him. He's gone. But if the seller says yes, okay, maybe I should talk it through the way it's on the slide. If the seller says yes, that means that you're going to run a second best mechanism, kind of the way that Myerson-Satisway derived, the static second best mechanism, with the buyer's value being drawn from the prior distribution F, and the seller's value being drawn from the distribution G, from the conditional distribution of C for C being less than P. Right? That is, you're saying, oh, I'm going to make sure you're an efficient seller, and now I'm going to run the second best mechanism for a situation where I know that the seller is efficient and the buyer is drawing its type from the prior distribution. And if the seller says no, you just reject the seller, and the buyer is going to trade if and only if he's an efficient type, right? If and only if his type is above P. So that induces, if you look at the dominant strategy implementation of that second best mechanism, that induces dominant strategies for the seller and for the buyer as well, because if the buyer participates in the second best mechanism, well then he's got the dominant strategy. And if the second best mechanism doesn't intrude, the only way that the buyer can trade is that he accepts the price offer P, and the dominant strategy is to accept that if and only if your value is above P. And of course, you proceed conversely if the stored agents are buyers, but then you just run the opposite second best mechanism. Okay, and so here the result is that with continuous distributions for tau, as soon as you store some agent, once you account for second best mechanism, you have a strict inequality. So the increase in market thickness is even larger once you account for incentives. And the reason is that storing alleviates the incentive problem. And so that's sort of the channel feature that we had for the posted price mechanism and the binary types. There, the incentive problem is completely solved as soon as you store one agent. Here, this is not the case with continuous types, but you alleviate the incentive problem. And the intuition is, I think, simple. So what I have on the left-hand graph is for uniformly distributed types, but that's just for illustrative purposes. This is the 45-degree line, right? And this is the second best mechanism that has a slope of, for uniform distributed types, has a slope of 1 starting at 1/4. And so you execute only trades that occur up here. And yeah. And so the right-hand graph has the same, but also this dashed line here. And that is, now things are particularly symmetric, but the basic logic is completely general. Things are particularly symmetric for the uniform distribution. This dashed line here is the second best mechanism for these 2 separate second best problems. One where you have only sellers stored, right? You have positive selection of seller types. It's a better seller distribution. You know that the sellers have types between 0 and 1/2. So that's a better distribution than if they have types between 0 and 1. And up here, it's the mechanism where the buyers are positively selected and the sellers come from the prior distribution. And the reason why this mechanism allows for more trade, or why these 2 mechanisms allow for more trade, is twofold. First of all, the distribution related but distinct. With suppose you have only sellers stored, and you run the second best mechanism, then you know that the seller's type is below 1/2, right? Rather than coming from the prior distribution. So that means you have a better distribution for the seller. So that's going to be good. But it also means, creates better trades, but it also means that you generate more revenue. And so you have to, the second best, the no deficit constraint is less tight because that distribution is better. And so that means that you distort the mechanism less away from first best. And so that's why that's exactly the way in which storing traders alleviates the incentive problem. And so now you need to be a little bit careful, but you see that here you're missing that much for the static second best mechanism, or for the prior distributions. You're missing that much on first best or on valuation welfare. And then you have these deltas here. For the dashed line, the deltas are larger and the loss here is smaller. And once you account for these things appropriately and you work on these formulas for a couple of days and eliminate all the errors, then you see that this inequality here actually holds. That's the sort of generalization of the posted price and no deficit result that we had for the efficient policy for binary types. Here, you still have an incentive problem, but it's alleviated by storing traders. Okay, as mentioned, here's the detailed literature review. If you don't see your paper, send me an email. So yeah, there's a large double auctions literature. I think made pretty clear how the paper connects to that. Talked about the valuation microfoundations. The posted price implementation has some connections that I didn't talk about here with the Haggerty-Rogerson posted price mechanism, right? So here you can think about this here being the Haggerty-Rogerson welfare that you get from by just posting that price, and that plays an important role in this paper here and in ongoing work with Ellen. It's something that I just realized while working on this here recently is that usually McAfee's mechanism, the 92 double auctions paper of his, is portrayed as a trade sacrifice mechanism, but so is Haggerty-Rogerson, or could Haggerty-Rogerson be portrayed, right? Because you post the price, and then if the buyer and seller are willing to trade, they trade, and otherwise you do not execute the trade. And so sometimes you sacrifice the efficient trade. So then what McAfee adds to that is that he endogenizes that posted price. Because you can use information gleaned from agents who do not trade on their efficiency. So what our posted price result does is kind of combines these mechanisms in that, at least for binary types, right? So you post a price, but then in the situation where McAfee and Haggerty-Rogerson would have to sacrifice a trade, well, we're going to store one, and that's going to be the efficient thing to do. So that's the connection to Haggerty-Rogerson and McAfee that I didn't talk about at that point. It's been upsurge of interest in dynamic mechanism design. Most of these papers are primarily concerned with the problem of eliciting information that evolves over time, whereas for our intents and purposes, the incentive problem is quite simple because the agents have persistent types, so we only have to elicit that information once. There's a type connection in terms of methods and formulation of the binary type problem that with the Bakar-Ali and Yarif paper that's just come out in TE on dynamic matching, and an older paper by Mohammed and Chengwu and co-author in JP. And last but not least, there's market making and intermediation literature in financial markets that typically takes a mechanism as given and then asks, you know, what's the, how can we increase market thickness using a given mechanism? Yeah, so let me wrap up. I think one of the results that comes from this paper is that optimally thick markets are surprisingly thin when measured by the number of traders, but yet behave surprisingly close to the competitive market limit. And yeah, I think I'm going to wrap up on this, but the results pertaining to the continuous distributions, even though we don't have any optimality results, they provide a lower bound of how much you could achieve from, or how much you need to achieve with an optimal mechanism, and they show that first order gains can be achieved with simple coarse mechanisms. Yeah, let me wrap up. Let me stop here.
All right. Thank you so much. It's very nice, and I think it gives us ideas that maybe we should start becoming market makers, because we don't really have to keep too many things on our books, and maybe there's something to be gained there. Are there any questions? If there are, just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. Well, if not, thank you so much, Simon. Let's all give Simon a virtual round of applause, and you know, even a real one too. It's been a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone who joined for this semester. It's been great having you, and I think the announcement is that we are now going to have a break, and we're just going to resume the next semester. And thank you once more all for coming to our seminars. Thank you.
Thanks for organizing it. See you.
Thank you, Simon.
Cheers.